I want to know, what's the strangest thing you have in your house?
Yeah, hold on a sec. So this is actually something that my wife desperately felt she needed, and I absolutely agree. And it's a box of teeth.
This is Box of Teeth, chewing over the stories behind the books, with our guest, Amy Jeffs.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Box of Teeth. This week we are joined by Dr. Amy Jeffs, who is the author and illustrator of Storyland. Hi!
Hello.
So, first question for you today. Can you summarise Storyland for us in one sentence?
It's a history of Britain through medieval eyes.
Ooh, I like that. I suppose it's like a modern retelling of like myths and legends of the medieval age. So why do you think myths and mythology are still so fascinating and still so important today?
I think that myths contain archetypes, things like extinction and the yearning to belong. What is a homeland? What does it mean to be part of a community of people? What's a nation? Those sorts of questions. Nation in a non-nation state sort of way. And so even though they contain quite unlikely scenarios, or they might do, I think they speak to us in a deep and human way.
And you've done a PhD in medieval art, was it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So what do you think the relationship between art and storytelling was in the medieval world and how it's changed today?
So one very famous quotation that if you're studying medieval art history, you will learn very early on, is from Gregory the Great, this pope who lived in the late 6th century, and he wrote a letter to the Bishop of Marseille, who was destroying images in churches. And if anyone has done any art history, they'll know that images and religion have an interesting and often tense relationship. And he said, don't do that, because it is through these images that the illiterate read. And so these images were telling the lives of saints or the lives of Christ, the life of Christ even. And so this was his argument. And I think you see that in secular art of the medieval period as well, this idea that images are a way of communicating stories quickly and in a way that doesn't depend on a Latin education or even the ability to read in the vernacular. So my PhD was focusing on a mid-14th century manuscript which contained a very abridged version of the origin myth of Britain, an abridged version of a poem called Wass's Roman de Brut. And it's heavily illustrated. And one of the things I argued was that it was created for the use of a boy of about 13, 14, embarking on his chivalric education. So maybe, or even he might have been a bit younger. It's one of these books that you're meant to read very quickly. The images help you digest it really quickly, and it's all about action and adventure and magic, and to get him really in the spirit of what it meant to be English and fight for England and for the English king, and what the history was that he was inheriting as an English knight. Potentially, that's.
Wow. Oh, I love that. So you always intended the collection to be illustrated then?
Yes, it was. So the book is structured as a series of 30 short stories, each one followed by a commentary. And each short story is a retelling of a medieval myth or legend about, how the dominant cultures of Britain came to populate the islands. And it really began as I was finishing my PhD on that manuscript that I just mentioned, Egerton MS 3028 at the British Library, if anyone wants to look it up. It's digitized. I decided I was going to produce some lino cut illustrations. And when I was thinking, what should they be of? I thought, well, let's make it of this origin myth of Britain, because it was very rarely illustrated in the Middle Ages and basically not illustrated at all in the modern period, more or less. So that felt like a freeing subject matter. So the book began as pictures, and I realized through the pictures, they convinced me, I think, of how great the stories are. And then when it came to convincing they first appeared in Country Life magazine, and then it was the illustrations I'd produced for that series of articles that I took to my literary agent, who at that point wasn't my literary agent. I think it was the pictures that helped to communicate the drama and excitingness of the stories. For instance, you can see on the shelf behind you, the cover of the book shows the goddess Diana sending Brutus to Albion. So she's this great big woman coming out of the fire, and he's this little guy you can see him in the bottom right hand corner of that cover there. And I think so the images are integral, if not, the very beginning of it all.
Yeah, they were the seed that grew the tree.
Exactly.
And why lino cut?
I just thought it was a really sexy medium because I loved the clarity. I think when it's just right, it's so crisp and perfect. So I loved lino cut for that. I also loved it for as a way of illustrating myth, because when I was just working with black ink, I was in this being taught by an artist called Chris Pigg, who makes amazing use of negative space in his prints, which are also black and white. So these large areas of black, for me, were like the visual expression of the way in which myth is kind of misty around the edges. You can't historicize it. You can't work out exactly what the costume would be because it's set in the mythic past. Yeah, you can't pinpoint it exactly. It's not actually in history, even though it nominally has a historical setting. So that, for me, those large areas of black were like the mistiness of myth. And that's why it seemed like the perfect medium.
Myth is a really interesting kind of area, and we shelve Storyland in nonfiction. Do you think of it as fiction or nonfiction? Do you have a line where you draw the difference, or is it blurring in the middle somewhere?
I'm really, really interested in how fiction impacts history. So we would call these myths fictional in the sense that we don't believe now that the Scottish people were founded by an Egyptian princess called Scotta, who was the daughter of Ramesses II, the same pharaoh to have a dispute with Moses, quite a famous one. We wouldn't say that's true now, but it was seen as history in the Middle Ages. And so those kind of fictions came to be used in really important political arguments about who had a right to rule over who in Britain, especially in the Anglo-Scottish conflict. There's also the whole story of King Arthur, which is slightly blurrier. Like, although he was seen as a legendary British king of the Britons, his story was elaborated upon so much in the Middle Ages in ways that probably were not seen as kind of true history or chronicle in that sense. And yet the whole spirit of the Arthurian court and the Round Table and the Order of Knights was actively emulated by Edward I and Edward III, and had really amazing consequences for the strength of those kings and their ability to make war against other kingdoms. So I think that in the same way, our present is shaped by the fiction we read. And so that's a very roundabout answer to your question.
There are so many different versions of a lot of the stories in your book. How did you choose which one you wanted to tell?
Okay, so first and foremost, I had to like it. I think that one of the great discoveries in writing Storyland was that nothing matters more when you're creating something, whoever you are, nothing matters more than your own aesthetic pleasure in that story or image or whatever it is. Because the minute you don't like something and you're trying to convey it to people, you're being dishonest. It's not going to be good. So that was the first thing. And also sort of sitting maybe on a par with that was its sense within the narrative. So when you get medieval chroniclers like Geoffrey of Monmouth telling a history of Britain, they are using disparate sources and they bring them together to weave a coherent narrative. And the narrative I wanted to tell was one in which we start with an empty island and we end with the Norman conquest, basically, and a kind of Britain that we would recognize now, I suppose, or at least that the Middle Ages would have recognized. And so those were my two kind of guiding principles. And there are some stories that I loved, but I felt, I mean, one example is the idea that Merlin, so there's a Life of Merlin, which may have been written by Geoffrey of Monmouth as well, and it ends by him giving his gift of prophecy to his sister Ganeda, and that's kind of how he's like, I'm done now. He's this old man, and he just, and that he passes that on to her. But I wanted him to die because I wanted an end to the Merlin story, and so I used a slightly different a different narrative in which he undergoes this kind of triple death. It's a trope in medieval literature and more widely. So, you know, luckily there are so many good stories, and there was a lot of choice, and there was a lot of surprising coherence between them, because the medieval view of history wasn't totally chaotic, you know, it actually was pretty solid, and so the stories could be woven into it with surprising ease.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think this is the thing about reading things from that time period, that they had such a completely different worldview. Like, if you've seen them, obviously you have, but for the audience, if you've seen the Mappa Mundi, it's like, what? People think the world looked like this, and yes, they did, because they, you know, they are living in what almost feels like a fantasy world. That's why so many fantasy books are set in the medieval period. It's so easy because their worldview is so different. And it's interesting in Britain as well, because they believed they were living on the westernmost point of the world. And I think you mentioned that in your prologue to the book as well. And that influences the stories, because these people see themselves as on the edges of civilization.
In the recent Anglo-Saxon Kingdoms exhibition at the British Library, there was a book called the Codex Amiatinus, and it's a whopper of a book. It's like, it used something like 1,500 calf skins to make the pages, and it's like, you know, it's like the dimensions of, you know, this window, this screen here. It's like this massive great spine, and it was made at Monk Wearmouth Jarrow. So basically, Bede talks about 3 giant Bibles that were made at Monk Wearmouth Jarrow, and that one was taken to Rome by Ceolfrith as a gift, and Ceolfrith died en route, and it was just assumed that this Bible was lost, that Bede was talking about. But then I think it's in the 19th century, somebody realized that there was this great big Bible in a monastery in Italy, and it had a dedication in it that had actually been doctored. And when they looked at it properly, they realized the dedication said Ceolfrith's name in it, and that this was the Bible that Ceolfrith had tried to take to Rome, had died en route and left in a monastery, or had ended up in a monastery. But the Bible had been always assumed to be Italian because it was so Italian in style. And basically what scholars have argued is that at Monk Wearmouth Jarrow in Northumberland, or Northumbria as it was known then, or as medievalists call it for that period, they were very keen to demonstrate their ability to produce a book of like really Roman aesthetic or Italian aesthetic, to show that the Christian message had been fulfilled. The missionaries had come to Britain, they'd converted the English in their case, or the Anglo-Irish, actually not in the case of Monk Wearmouth Jarrow, not the Anglo-Irish. Sorry if there are any scholars listening, ignore me. And that was showing that the gospel message had been fulfilled, that Christianity had been spread to the furthest corners of the earth. They were like, we might be on the absolute back of beyond in the Western Ocean on this windy little island, but we can produce something that's worthy of Rome. So that's exactly what you were saying, this idea that there's a kind of like slight inferiority complex perhaps, but then a really kind of determined movement to disprove that sense of being on the edge.
And a very clear awareness of a place within a global culture as well, which I think is something, if you look into the past, people assume that that's not there, but of course it is. You know, people did travel quite a lot.
And I think it's really important to note that, you know, the founding mothers and fathers of the cultures within Britain are Syrian and Trojan and Egyptian and Greek. And there was this, it's really important to those early storytellers that the kind of status of the classical and biblical worlds that is sort of centered in the Middle East travels to this outpost in the Western Ocean, and kind of instills the later kings with that authority, or kings and queens.
Who's your personal favorite mythological figure? Doesn't have to be from your book, obviously, anybody.
Albina.
Nice. Why?
I mean, she is from my book, sorry, but she
no, that's great.
The eldest of 30 Syrian princesses that are banished by their father in a rudderless boat and wash up on the shores of a completely uninhabited, unnamed nothing island. And they learn to live off the land, and she names herself queen and names the island Albion after herself. And there's this fantastic passage in the medieval account of their story, in which it describes them learning to sort of make snares and weave nets and all sorts of things like that. I quote it in the book, and they're like the Bear Grylls, for want of a better analogy. But I just think it's just such a amazing image, these 30 women arriving in Albion, calling it Albion, ruling it, and learning to live off the land. And that she's my favorite, I think. Yeah, if I could go back and meet a mythological figure, it would be her.
I respect that 100%. She sounds very cool. So some of the stories directly contradict each other, and you almost chose those, I think, deliberately. Did you? I want to know.
Yeah, so let me think. There's the super obvious conflict is between the Scottish and the English royal origin regnal myths, and whether or not the English king has a right to rule the whole of Britain.
Yeah.
So
talking about
brilliant.
Things that are still relevant.
Yeah, it's fascinating to read, and how these origin myths were, in the Declaration of Arbroath, in 1320, the Scottish origin myth is called upon to justify Scottish independence, and it's that's in direct retaliation to the use of the Edward I used the British origin myth to justify his claim to overlordship, and he was supported by the Pope. So these stories are not inconsequential. People often think of like stories that have giants and prophecies in as being kind of like, a bit of whimsy, a bit of sitting around the fire and telling nice stories. Like, no, these are in important manuscripts, they're depicted in important genealogical roles that and they're spoken about in contexts that were having serious political consequences.
Yeah, like people sitting around telling stories of like Cowenna and Havelock the Dane was kind of like that period of history's equivalent of us sitting in history class learning about the Norman invasion and the Henry Tudor and all of that kind of stuff. Yeah,
I think so. I mean, it's important. I know you know this, but obviously the medieval concept of history was maybe different from ours.
It wasn't necessarily about fact.
Yeah, I think, because I think that the one helpful way of looking at the Middle Ages is that it had an allegorical mindset. And if history showed the way in which a certain people fitted into a grand cosmological narrative that was kind of Christian in its journey, and showed that they were kind of favored by God and part of a divine plan, that was more what the history was aiming to do than it was to, and it was a very important source of moral exemplar. So Bede talks about how history offers loads of examples of the deeds of great men, and so there was a really important moral dimension to history that maybe we don't talk about now. I think maybe we still think it should have that, and I think we still read history as a form of maybe with a moral outlook, but I don't think that's accepted at a university level, you know, that kind of thing. So yeah, that would be one way of comparing or contrasting views of history now and then.
What's a fun like medieval fact that you didn't know before you started writing this book?
So one that I absolutely love is the etymology of the word pedigree.
Oh yeah.
In the Middle Ages, there was an increasing fashion from the sort of late 13th century onwards for the aristocracy and royalty to produce genealogical scrolls that were essentially like a family tree. Not necessarily, well, they're strips of parchment glued together to make these long scrolls, and they have a diagram that runs down it that's kind of a central branch that splits out to show the different family members, and they were called pedigree, which means foot of a crane, because of the way it was like a wading bird's foot with this main stem coming down and then the little branches coming off to show the sisters or the brothers and sisters of a certain person. And so that became sort of contracted to pedigree by the later Middle Ages, and then entered into Middle English and now is with us still. So it actually means crane's foot. You know, I thought that was mind-blowingly interesting.
That is fascinating. I'm also, you know, super fascinated in linguistics and how words evolve and things, especially because there's so much of that relation between, well, what came from Brittonic and then what was then from the Norman invasion and, you know, French influence. And anyway, sorry, we could talk about that all day. We won't. We'll behave ourselves. Okay. What's the weirdest thing in your house?
It's in the garage. I wish I could show you. I've got a tiny model of a dragon made out of owl bones.
Owl bones?
Yeah.
Wow, that is nice and weird. I approve of that one.
It was something I made when I was about 17, and the talons made really good horns to go down the back of the dragon.
Where did you get owl bones when you were 17?
Found a dead owl in the road and took it home, put it in a flower pot, took a lot of pictures of maggots, and waited for it to be a skeleton, and then made a tiny dragon out of it.
That is both amazing and slightly terrifying. Awesome. Thank you so much. Your answers were so interesting. I enjoyed that immensely.
Thank you, Rhian. So did I.
Run, kangaroo, oh, chin, chin, run, kangaroo, oh, chin, chin,